The ship landed gently on the alien planet, its engines humming softly as it came to a stop. The human soldier, John, stepped out, feeling a rush of excitement mixed with nervousness. He was part of a diplomatic mission to the distant planet of Velphora, a world known for its advanced technology and strange customs. John had heard stories about the Velphorian people, but he never expected to be here, standing at the foot of a grand palace, ready to meet their most powerful ruler, Princess Syra. Syra was unlike anyone John had ever met. Her reputation as a leader was fierce. She was known for her cold, calculated decisions and her refusal to trust anyone, especially outsiders. Rumors about her made her seem almost untouchable, a ruler who played her cards perfectly and never showed any weakness. John had no idea how he would fit into her world, but he had been told to behave respectfully, listen, and do whatever was asked of him. The grand palace doors opened, and he was led inside by an alien servant. The walls were lined with precious stones that glowed softly, casting an ethereal light on the marble floors. The palace was enormous, filled with artifacts and paintings of ancient Velphorian history. John couldn't help but feel like a tiny speck in a world so grand and ancient. As they approached the main hall, the doors swung open to reveal a lavish room where a grand feast was being held. Alien delegates from various planets, including other species, filled the space, their eyes turning toward the human soldier as he entered. John stood tall, trying to keep his composure, but the weight of their stares made him feel self-conscious. He had never been in a place like this before, surrounded by beings of different shapes and sizes. At the far end of the room, seated on an elevated throne, was Princess Syra. She was a sight to behold. Her golden hair flowed like liquid sunlight, and her eyes were a piercing shade of violet that seemed to see right through him. She wore a crown made of silver and intricate gemstones, a symbol of her status as the heir to the Velphorian throne. But it wasn't her beauty that caught his attention. It was the aura of power around her. She held herself like a queen, her gaze sharp and unwavering. John was introduced to her by a senior diplomat, but he barely registered the formalities. His heart raced as he tried to find the right words, but before he could speak, Princess Syra's voice rang out, commanding the attention of the entire room. "You," she said, pointing directly at John, "you will share my bed tonight." The room fell silent. John froze, unsure if he had heard her correctly. Did she just say what he thought she said? The other delegates looked around nervously, clearly uncomfortable with her bluntness. Some glanced at each other, while others tried to avoid eye contact. The tension in the room thickened, and all eyes were now on John. John's mind raced. Was this some sort of cultural custom? Did she mean something else? He had heard rumors about how the Velphorians respected strength, and perhaps this was some kind of test. His pulse quickened, and he had to fight the urge to step back. Was he supposed to refuse? Could he? He was a soldier, not a diplomat. He wasn't trained for moments like this. Before he could answer, Syra's cold eyes locked onto his. "Do not keep me waiting, human," she said, her voice sharp, commanding. John took a deep breath. There was no choice but to follow her order. His mind was spinning, but he stood tall and nodded. "Yes, Princess," he said, his voice steady, even though his heart was pounding in his chest. Syra smiled faintly, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good," she replied. "You will come to my chambers once the feast is over." The room erupted in whispers. Delegates exchanged looks, clearly shocked by the princess's bold declaration. Some shook their heads, others looked at John with pity, and a few even seemed amused. But John couldn't pay attention to them. His mind was consumed with one thought. What had he just agreed to? The feast continued, but John's attention was elsewhere. He couldn't focus on the food or the conversations around him. His thoughts were racing. Why had she chosen him? What did she mean by "share my bed"? Was this a test of some kind? He had been told to keep his distance and act respectfully, but now it felt like everything he knew had been turned upside down. He had expected challenges, but not this. As the evening went on, the princess did not speak to him again. She remained seated at her throne, observing the guests with a cold gaze. But John couldn't stop thinking about her. There was something about her, something that both intimidated and intrigued him. Despite her harsh words, he could sense a sadness in her eyes, a loneliness that seemed to be hidden behind the walls of her power. When the feast finally came to an end, John was escorted to the princess's private chambers. His mind was still in a haze, unsure of what he was walking into. As he entered the room, Syra was already waiting. The room was dimly lit, and the atmosphere was heavy with tension. "Come," she said simply, her voice commanding. "We have much to discuss." John stepped forward, his heart still racing. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain. His life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The princess's demand. The door to Princess Syra's private chambers closed behind John with a soft thud, and the quiet, tense air of the room seemed to press down on him. His heart was still racing, his mind overwhelmed with the events of the evening. He couldn't shake the words she had spoken to him in front of everyone. "You will share my bed tonight," she had said. Now, standing in her private chambers, John could hardly believe what was happening. This wasn't a simple diplomatic mission anymore. This was something entirely different. Princess Syra, the powerful, cold ruler of the Velforian people, had ordered him to join her in her personal space, something that no one could have predicted. The room was dimly lit, with the soft glow of candles casting long shadows on the stone walls. A large bed sat at the center of the room, draped with luxurious fabric that shimmered like silver. The room felt both regal and intimate, the kind of place where a ruler would feel at ease, surrounded by the comforts of wealth and power. But despite the beauty of the space, John felt a coldness in the air, an unspoken tension that seemed to fill every corner. Syra stood by the window, her back to him, looking out over the palace grounds. Her golden hair cascaded down her back in waves, and her violet eyes seemed distant, lost in thought. She didn't turn around when John entered, as though she was waiting for him to make the next move. John hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. He had been trained for combat, for survival, for missions. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. He had never been in a situation like this, and he didn't know how to act. The princess finally spoke, her voice smooth, but with a firmness that left no room for question. "Come here, human," she said, her tone almost impersonal. John stepped forward cautiously, his every move feeling too slow, too deliberate. As he approached her, Syra turned to face him, her expression unreadable. She looked him up and down, her gaze intense and calculating, as if she were studying him, trying to understand him. John stood tall, trying to maintain his composure, but inside, he was a storm of confusion and nervousness. "You were chosen because you are different from the others," Syra said, breaking the silence. "You are not like the others who come to this planet to bow, to please. You stand strong. You do not bend to my power, and that intrigues me." John tried to speak, but his throat felt dry, and the words wouldn't come. The princess didn't wait for him to answer, though. She was already moving, walking slowly around the room, her steps graceful like a dancer. As she moved, she spoke again, her voice softer this time, but still commanding. "Many have tried to earn my trust," she continued, "but none have succeeded. They come with their gifts, their flattery, their promises. They think they can win me over with their words, but they are all the same. Weak, predictable. You, human, are different, and that is why I have chosen you." John felt a mix of emotions, honor, confusion, fear, but also something else. A small flicker of curiosity. What did she mean by all this? What did she want from him? Syra paused in front of the bed, her eyes meeting his for the first time since they had entered the room. Her gaze was piercing, and it sent a shiver down his spine. "You are here because you will help me understand something," she said quietly. I have never shared my bed with anyone. It is not a tradition of mine, but I have heard of your species, how you form bonds, how you trust. I want to understand that, to see if it's true, if you are capable of such things. John's mind whirled. She wasn't just talking about a physical connection. She was talking about something deeper, something he wasn't sure he was ready for. But, Princess, I don't understand, John finally managed to say, his voice shaking slightly. Why me? I'm just a soldier. I'm not a diplomat. I don't know what you're asking for. Syra's expression softened, just slightly. It was a rare moment of vulnerability that John caught, like a crack in the armor she had built around herself. She moved closer to him, and her presence seemed to fill the room. You are a soldier, yes, she said, her voice almost gentle now. But you are not like the others. You see me, not as a princess, but as a person. You have not bowed before me. You have not tried to impress me. I respect that. John didn't know what to say. He had always seen her as a ruler, a figure to be respected from afar. But now, in this moment, he saw her as something else. There was a loneliness in her eyes, a longing that she tried to hide behind her power. You will share my bed tonight, human, Syra repeated, but this time her tone was softer, more intimate. And in doing so, you will help me understand something I have never understood before. John stood still, unsure of what would happen next. Was this truly a test? Was she trying to break him to see if he would submit? Or was it something else entirely? Something deeper, more complex. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he saw beyond the crown and the throne. He saw a woman, isolated by her power, looking for something real, something beyond the rules of her world. John finally nodded, his voice steady despite the whirlwind inside him. I will, Princess. Syra's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't a smile of victory, but one of understanding. She had made her choice, and so had he. The night ahead was uncertain, filled with tension, but also the promise of something that neither of them could yet understand. The princess had made her demand, and now there was no turning back. The challenge begins. The night stretched on, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. John sat at the edge of the grand bed, his heart thudding in his chest. The princess, Syra, had given him a command, one that felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 stars. Her words had been clear, but their meaning was far from simple. Tonight, you will share my bed, human, she had said, but what followed wasn't just a command. It was an invitation into a world he hadn't known existed. He looked at the princess across the room. She stood by the large window, her figure silhouetted against the pale glow of the twin moons. The shadows made her seem even more distant, even more untouchable. Yet in this private chamber, it was clear that the power she held wasn't just about the throne. It was about control, about testing, and about something else John couldn't quite put into words. Syra didn't speak for a long time. She simply stared out at the dark landscape beyond the palace, her mind clearly elsewhere. John, still unsure of what to do, tried not to focus on the uneasy knot in his stomach. He had never felt this way before. His military training had prepared him for everything: combat, survival, diplomacy. But this was different. Do you know why I brought you here, human? Syra's voice was calm but demanding. She didn't turn to face him, but the question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. John swallowed hard. No, princess, I don't. She turned slowly, her violet eyes meeting his. Because you are not like the others, she said, her words filled with a cold certainty. Others come to me with their gifts, their false promises of respect. But you are different. You see me as more than just a princess. You see me as a woman, someone who deserves to be understood, not just admired from afar. John's heart skipped a beat. She was right, in a way. From the moment he had arrived on Velthor, he hadn't seen her as the untouchable ruler others did. He had respected her power, Yes, but he hadn't let it cloud his judgment. There was something raw in her eyes, a desire to be seen as more than a symbol, more than a tool for political gain. "I don't know if I understand you, Princess," John said honestly, his voice low. "But I'm trying." Syra stepped closer, her movements graceful and purposeful. She didn't touch him, but her presence seemed to fill the space between them. "Understanding is the first step. Now let's see if you are capable of taking the next one." Before he could respond, Syra suddenly turned away, walking to a nearby table and picking up something small. She returned to him, a peculiar smile on her lips. "I want to see if you can handle the challenge I've set before you," she said, her voice now carrying a hint of amusement. John frowned, confused. "Challenge." She held out a small device, a strange-looking contraption that hummed softly in her hand. "This is a test," Syra explained. "It will measure your strength, your will, and your ability to endure. If you pass, I will consider you worthy of sharing more than just my bed." John stared at the device in her hand, unsure of what she meant. "What kind of test is this?" "A test of resolve," she replied simply. "If you are truly different from the others, then you will not shy away from it. You will prove that you can rise above whatever challenges I place before you." There was no warning. The moment Syra pressed the button on the device, a sharp sting shot through John's arm. He gasped, surprised by the sudden jolt of pain. His muscles tensed, his vision blurred for a moment. The pain was like nothing he had ever felt before, hot, sharp, and seemingly endless. But he didn't scream. He didn't pull away. He fought against it, gritting his teeth as the device sent waves of pain throughout his body. His vision returned, but the pain remained, like a constant pressure in his chest. "Is this your test, Princess?" John forced the words out, his voice strained but defiant. "Pain." Syra's eyes glimmered with approval, but there was no pity in her gaze. "Pain is part of the challenge," she said, "but it is not the whole test. It is about how you handle it, how you remain in control. If you can survive this, if you can show me that you are not like the others, then I will know you are worthy." John's heart pounded in his ears, but he refused to give in. He had faced worse before. In combat, in training, even in his own life. But this was different. This was personal. The device continued its painful pulse, but John's focus sharpened. He forced himself to breathe deeply, to ignore the pain that tried to consume him. It wasn't just about surviving this test. It was about showing Syra that he wasn't afraid, that he could handle whatever she threw at him. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Finally, the pain stopped. The device in Syra's hand went silent, and she lowered it, her gaze still locked on John. She was watching him closely, waiting for his reaction. John didn't collapse. He didn't show weakness. He stood tall, sweat beading on his forehead, his chest heaving with the effort it took to stay upright. But he didn't break. "Is that all you have, Princess?" he asked, his voice still steady, though it was clear that he was exhausted. Syra's smile grew wider, but it was tinged with respect. "You passed," she said simply. "You have proven that you are different, stronger than the others." John nodded, but inside, he was still processing what had just happened. The test wasn't just about physical strength. It was about his resolve, his will to endure. And for some reason, Syra wanted to see if he had it. But this was just the beginning. Whatever challenges she had in store, John knew he would need to be prepared. Because now he had proven something. He had proven that he wasn't afraid to face whatever Syra demanded of him. And that was only the start of the challenge ahead. Trust and secrets. John sat alone in the grand chamber, his mind racing after the intense test he had just endured. The princess, Syra, had left him there, saying nothing more than, "Rest. You will need your strength for what comes next." The pain from the device was still a dull throb in his muscles, but it was the uncertainty that troubled him more now. Syra had challenged him, tested him, but there was more to her than what he had seen so far. He knew that. She was powerful, yes, but there was something else. A layer to her personality that she had kept hidden. Something deeper than just a royal command or an invitation into her bed. As the silence stretched on, John couldn't help but think about the way Syra had looked at him. There was no fear in her eyes, only curiosity and, dare he say it, something more. He had passed her test, but she hadn't let her guard down. She was still watching him, waiting to see if he would break, waiting to see if he was really as strong as he claimed to be. But John wasn't a man to back down easily. He had been through hell and back, in the military and in life. He had survived things no one should have to face, and now he was facing something entirely different. A challenge that wasn't about survival, but about trust. And that was something he wasn't sure he could give, not yet. Suddenly, the door to the chamber opened, and Syra entered without a word. She looked at him, her violet eyes intense, as always, but there was a softness to her gaze now, something John hadn't expected. She wasn't the untouchable princess anymore. She was human, in a way, vulnerable, even. "You look better," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. The pain should have subsided by now. John nodded, though the truth was, his body still ached from the test. But there was something else in his chest, a strange feeling he couldn't quite explain. "I'm fine. The pain doesn't bother me." Syra gave a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She moved to the table across the room and poured a drink from a crystal decanter. The liquid was a deep blue, glowing faintly in the dim light. "You should drink this," she said, turning back to him. "It will help with the recovery, and it will calm your mind." John was about to refuse but hesitated. There was something about her presence, that made him feel like he could trust her, even if just a little. He rose from the chair and accepted the glass. The liquid was cold, smooth, and a little bitter as it slid down his throat. It had a calming effect almost immediately, dulling the edges of the pain and soothing his racing thoughts. "Thank you," he said quietly, lowering the glass. Syra didn't respond right away. She seemed lost in her own thoughts. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower, almost hesitant. "There's something you need to understand about me, John, about why I do the things I do." He raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Syra stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm not just a princess, a ruler of Velfor. I carry a burden that no one else understands." Her voice faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "I spent my whole life being used, controlled, and kept in the shadows. No one sees me for who I really am, not even my people." John stayed silent, sensing that this was something important. Syra didn't speak of her past often, and she seemed to be choosing her words carefully. "I was raised to be a weapon," Syra continued, her tone distant now. "My father, the king, trained me to rule and to fight. I had no choice. There was no room for weakness. But the more I grew, the more I realized that I didn't want to be what he made me. I wanted to be free, to make my own choices." John could see the pain in her eyes, a flicker of the vulnerability she had kept hidden so far. He had never seen her like this, and it stirred something in him, something that made him question everything he had believed about her. "So, you challenge people because of your father?" John asked, his voice low. Syra shook her head. "It's not just that. It's because I can't trust anyone. I push people away before they can hurt me. I test them to see if they'll break under pressure, to see if they're strong enough to face what I carry." John stared at her, understanding now. It wasn't about the power she held. It was about the pain she had endured. She had built walls around herself to protect her heart, but those walls had made her cold, distant. And now, John was seeing the cracks in that armor, seeing a woman who, despite her strength, was just as human as anyone else. "I'm sorry," John said, his voice softening. "I didn't know." Syra turned away, though her back was to him. She seemed more vulnerable than before. "You don't have to apologize." It's not your fault." John took a step closer, his voice steady. "You don't have to do this alone, Syra. You don't have to push everyone away. I'm not like the others. I won't hurt you." For a moment, Syra said nothing. Then, slowly, she turned back to face him. Her eyes searched his face, as if looking for any sign of deception, any hint that he was just another person trying to take advantage of her. Finally, she spoke, her voice almost a whisper. "Do you really mean that, John? Can I trust you?" John's heart beat faster, the weight of her question pressing down on him. He knew what she was asking. It wasn't just about their physical connection, or the power dynamic between them. It was about something deeper, something neither of them had been willing to confront until now. "I'll prove it to you," John said firmly, his voice unwavering. "I won't break your trust. Not now, not ever." Syra studied him for a long time before she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Then we have to start somewhere, don't we?" The air between them shifted, no longer filled with tension, but with something else. Something new. Syra had let her guard down, just a little, and in that small moment, John could see the woman behind the princess. And maybe, just maybe, they could build something real together. But only time would tell if trust could truly be earned. A growing attraction. The days passed quickly in the palace, each one blending into the next. John had grown used to the routines, the long hours of training, and the quiet moments he spent with Syra. The challenges had become less about survival and more about understanding each other. But there was something else growing between them, a strange, undeniable pull that neither of them could ignore. John had always been a man who kept his emotions in check. He had learned to shut off the parts of himself that could be easily hurt, to focus only on what was in front of him. But Syra was different. She was a puzzle, a beautiful and complex one that he was beginning to solve, piece by piece. And with each new discovery, he found himself drawn to her more and more. Syra, for her part, seemed to struggle with the same feelings. She had spent her entire life hiding behind walls, keeping herself untouchable to everyone around her. But John was different. There was something about him that made her feel safe, something that allowed her to let down her guard, even just a little. It had started with the small moments, the way John would look at her when she wasn't paying attention, the warmth in his voice when he spoke to her, and the way he always respected her boundaries, no matter how much she pushed him. She had tested him in so many ways, yet he had never faltered. In fact, he had become someone she trusted more than anyone in her life. One afternoon, Syra found herself watching John from across the room as he trained. His muscles rippled with each movement, his focus intense as he worked with the weaponry. She couldn't help but admire his strength, not just in the physical sense, but in his determination, his will to never give up. John caught her watching him, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. She quickly looked away, feeling a rush of heat in her cheeks. Syra wasn't used to feeling this way. She had never allowed herself to be vulnerable with anyone. But with John, things were different. She wanted to be close to him, to feel his presence near her, but a part of her still held back, unsure if she could truly trust him with her heart. John, on the other hand, was struggling with the same emotions. He knew the attraction was there. He could feel it every time Syra was near him, in the way his heart raced when she smiled at him, or the way his thoughts wandered to her late at night. But he had to be careful. He couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. Not when everything was so uncertain. It wasn't just the physical attraction that pulled him toward her. It was something deeper, something that connected them in a way he couldn't explain. There were moments when Syra would look at him with those deep violet eyes, and he would swear he could see the pain and loneliness hidden inside her. She had a power about her, but there was a fragility there too, and that made her even more beautiful in his eyes. One evening, after a long day of training, Syra invited John to join her in the garden. It was a quiet, peaceful place, surrounded by tall trees with flowers that bloomed in the most vibrant colors. The air was warm, and the stars above twinkled brightly. Sarah had always found solace here, away from the pressures of her royal duties. John was surprised by the invitation, but he didn't hesitate. He followed her into the garden, the scent of flowers filling the air. They walked in silence for a while, side by side, each lost in their own thoughts. The moonlight bathed the space in a soft glow, casting a silvery light over everything. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I used to come here when I needed to think. It's one of the few places where I feel like I can be myself." John nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I can see why. It's beautiful." They stopped near a small fountain, the water glistening as it cascaded down. Sarah sat on the stone bench beside it, patting the space next to her. John hesitated for only a moment before sitting down beside her. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt natural, like they had been here before, like they had always known each other. Sarah turned toward him, her gaze steady. "John, She stopped, her words catching in her throat. She was about to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, she looked down at her hands, unsure of what to say next. John reached out, his hand gently touching hers. The simple contact sent a shock through her, and she looked up at him in surprise. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to say anything." But with John, it felt safe. He wasn't pushing her, wasn't demanding anything from her. He was simply there. The tension between them grew, but it wasn't the kind of tension that came from anger or fear. It was the kind that came from something deeper, something neither of them could deny any longer. The attraction was there, raw and undeniable. Before she could say anything else, John turned toward her, his face inches from hers. His breath was warm against her skin, and she could feel the steady beat of his heart. Her own heart raced in her chest, her pulse quickening as she found herself drawn closer to him. And then, without thinking, without hesitation, John leaned in and kissed her. It was a soft kiss at first, gentle, almost tentative. But as soon as their lips met, a spark ignited between them, and the kiss deepened. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to give in. She kissed him back, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. In that moment, nothing else mattered. There was no test, no challenge, no power struggle. There was only the two of them, caught in the heat of their growing attraction, a bond that neither of them could ignore any longer. As they pulled away, breathless, Sarah looked into John's eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what this is, but I can't fight it." John smiled, his forehead resting against hers. "Neither can I." And for the first time, both of them felt something more than the duty or the tests. They felt something real, something that was starting to grow into something neither of them could count. The morning after, the morning sunlight streamed through the open window, casting a soft glow over the room. John stirred awake, his mind still foggy from the night before. He could feel the warmth of the blankets, but more than that, he could feel the presence beside him. Sarah, her soft breathing filled the quiet space, and for a moment, he simply lay there, trying to collect his thoughts. Last night had been a blur. The kiss, the closeness, the way everything had felt so right, yet so unexpected. John had never imagined that his connection with Sarah would lead to something so intimate. And now, as the morning light gently woke him, he felt a strange mixture of emotions, confusion, excitement, and an undeniable pull toward her that he couldn't ignore. He glanced over at Sarah, who was still asleep beside him. Her long, dark hair cascaded over the pillow, and the peaceful expression on her face made her look almost vulnerable. It was a side of her he hadn't seen before. Last night, they had both let their guards down, and for a brief moment, they had been just two people, sharing something that felt almost like a dream. John's heart beat a little faster as he watched her, unsure of what to do next. What had happened between them last night? Was it just a moment of weakness, a result of the growing tension between them? Or was it something more? He didn't know, but he couldn't deny that a part of him wanted to know more, wanted to explore what had begun. Suddenly, Syra shifted in her sleep, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked a few times, clearly disoriented, before her gaze landed on John. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence thick with uncertainty. "Good morning," John said, his voice quiet, almost unsure. Syra sat up slowly, her face flushed. She ran a hand through her hair, clearly trying to gather herself. Her eyes avoided his, and she wrapped the blanket tightly around her shoulders, as if she needed some space to think. "Good morning," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. John could feel the tension building between them, the awkwardness that had never existed before. After all that had happened, the kiss, the emotions, the intimacy, how were they supposed to act now? Neither of them had any idea what to do. I didn't expect this," Syra said, her voice trembling slightly as she looked at him. "Last night, I didn't think I would." John's heart raced. "It's okay," he said quickly. "We don't have to talk about it right now." But Syra was already pulling away, retreating into herself. Her eyes were filled with uncertainty, a vulnerability that John hadn't seen before. She was used to being strong, to being the princess who controlled everything around her. But now she seemed unsure of herself, unsure of what she had just shared with him. "I don't know what to say," she confessed, her words coming out in a rush. I've never been like this with anyone before." John sat up, his mind racing as he searched for the right words to say. "Syra, I didn't mean to make you feel uncomfortable. He hesitated, unsure of how to express what he was feeling. "Last night felt real. I don't want to mess that up." Syra looked at him then, her eyes searching his face. "Real," she repeated, her voice soft. "I don't even know what's real anymore. I've always had to be in control, always had to be the one in charge. But last night, I felt something I wasn't ready for. I don't know how to handle it." John nodded slowly, understanding her words more than she might have realized. "I get it. You've always had to be strong, to protect yourself. I'm not trying to take that away from you. I just want to be here for you." Syra looked down, her expression conflicted. "You're not like the others," she said quietly. "You're not like the men I've known, the ones who always wanted something from me. But last night, it was different. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing." John reached out slowly, his hand resting gently on hers. "It's not about what anyone wants from you, Syra. It's about what we want for ourselves. And right now, I think we both need to figure that out." She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she let out a deep breath and met his eyes again. "I think you're right," she said softly. "But I'm scared, John. I've never felt this way before. It's like I'm losing control, and I don't know how to get it back." John smiled, his heart swelling with affection for her. He could see the fear in her eyes, but he could also see the trust she was beginning to place in him. It was fragile, like glass, but it was there. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," he said gently. "We'll figure it out together. I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, in the quiet of the morning, taking in the weight of the situation. The silence wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was a moment of understanding, a moment where they both realized that they were in uncharted territory. They had crossed a line, and now they had to decide what it meant. Finally, Syra spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "I think I need some time to think. I didn't expect things to happen this way." John nodded. "Take all the time you need. I'm here." With a small, hesitant smile, Syra stood up from the bed, pulling the blanket tighter around her. She didn't look back at him as she walked to the door, but before she left, she paused. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but sincere, "for not rushing me." John watched her go, his heart heavy with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to walk away from this. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. As the door closed behind her, John sat in silence, his thoughts swirling around him. He knew the road ahead would be complicated, filled with challenges and confusion. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like something real was beginning to take shape, and no matter how difficult it might be, he was willing to fight for it. A new path forward. The sun was higher in the sky now, casting its golden light across the palace courtyard. John stood outside, watching as the world moved around him. The sounds of footsteps, the murmur of conversations, and the rustling of leaves in the wind filled the air. But despite the life around him, John felt like he was in his own world, deep in thought. It had been a few days since Syra had left the room that morning. They hadn't spoken much after that, and John could feel the distance growing between them. Sarah had retreated into herself, becoming more distant and reserved. John couldn't blame her. He knew she was trying to process everything that had happened between them, and he understood that she needed time. But time was running out. John had been brought here for a reason, and he couldn't forget that. His mission still loomed over him. The peace treaty, the role he was supposed to play in it. Yet despite all that, his heart kept drifting back to Syra, to the princess who had shown him a side of herself he never expected, to the woman he was slowly beginning to care for. He sighed deeply, rubbing his face with both hands. "What do I do now?" he whispered to himself. Just as he spoke, he heard a soft voice behind him. "John." He turned around quickly, and there she was. Syra. She stood a few steps away, looking at him with a mix of uncertainty and determination in her eyes. Her posture was straighter than before, and she didn't look as guarded as she had the last time they spoke. There was something different about her now, a shift in the air between them. "Syra," John said, his voice filled with a mixture of surprise and hope. She took a step closer. "I've been thinking a lot these past few days," she began, her voice steady, though there was a slight tremor in it. "About everything. About us." John's heart skipped a beat. "And?" Syra exhaled slowly, looking down at her hands for a moment before meeting his eyes. "I won't lie and say that I have all the answers. But I do know one thing. I can't keep running from this, from what happened between us." John's chest tightened with anticipation. "Syra." She held up her hand to stop him. "Let me finish," she said softly. "I've always been the one who had control, the one who made the decisions. But you've shown me that there's more to life than power. More than just being a princess and holding the weight of the galaxy on my shoulders. You've shown me a part of myself I didn't even know existed." John stepped toward her, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to take away your strength. I just wanted you to see that there's more than the world you've known. I don't want to be just another part of your life. I want to be the one who makes you feel safe, who helps you find the happiness you deserve." Syra's eyes softened as she looked at him. She stepped even closer, closing the distance between them. "And I want that too, John," she said, her voice strong but warm. "But I need you to understand that this isn't going to be easy. There are people who will never accept us, and there will be challenges ahead, challenges I can't even begin to predict." John smiled softly. "I don't expect it to be easy, but I know we can face whatever comes our way, together." She looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then, with a deep breath, she nodded. "Together. But I want to make sure we both understand what this means. This bond between us. It's not just something that happened because of a moment of weakness. It's real. And I need to know that you're ready to face what comes with it." John didn't hesitate. "I'm ready, Syra. I'm more ready than I've ever been." Syra smiled then, a genuine smile, one that made John's heart swell with warmth. It was a smile that told him everything would be okay, that whatever challenges they faced, they would face them together. "I'm glad to hear that," she said, her voice soft but certain, "because we have a long road ahead of us." John nodded. "I know, but I wouldn't want to walk it with anyone else but you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, together in the quiet morning, knowing that the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be theirs to walk. The future was uncertain, but it was something they would build together. "I think we should start by talking," Syra said, breaking the silence. "Not just about us, but about everything. The treaty, the future, what it all means. I'm not sure where we go from here, but I want us to be on the same page." John agreed. "Yes, we'll take it one step at a time." Syra reached out then, taking his hand in hers. Her touch was warm, reassuring. She gave him a small, uncertain smile, but it was a smile filled with hope. Hope for the future, hope for what they could build together. "You're right," she said, "one step at a time." As they stood there, hand in hand, they both knew that whatever lay ahead would be a challenge, but it would also be the beginning of something new. Something neither of them had ever expected, but both of them were willing to fight for. And in that moment, as they walked side by side into the future, they realized that this was only the start of their journey, a journey where trust, understanding, and love would guide them. No matter what the universe threw their way, they would face it together.